Hello, everyone. We're very excited to be just about to start this webinar. I will just give a moment to let participants enter the room, and then we'll get going. Okay. Well, hello and welcome to all, to distinguished speakers and to participants wherever you may be joining us from in the world. My name is Peter Taylor. I'm Director of Research at the Institute of Development Studies, and we're really delighted to be hosting this event today as our contribution to the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the independence of Bangladesh. IDS has a long and proud history of working through partnerships in Bangladesh, researching various development issues since the 1970s, and IDS has had a front row seat in witnessing the immense changes that have taken place there over time. And we're also really committed to continuing our collaborations with colleagues and organizations in Bangladesh, many of which are active right now and who are also represented in this webinar today. And we really hope to continue to build and grow our collaborations in Bangladesh in the coming years. IDS is also a frequent convener of conversations and debates about a wide range of development challenges, which we view increasingly as universal, whether they relate to health, climate, inequities and inequalities, or empowerment and accountability. The pandemic has highlighted how interconnected all of our lives are and the importance of co-creating knowledge and sharing experience that helps us work more closely together. So today, we're really proud to host this webinar, and particularly to welcome a number of eminent Bangladeshi thought leaders working on Bangladesh to reflect on its amazing journey and also to reflect critically on how Bangladesh tackles the next generation of challenges. So moderated by my IDS colleague Sohela Nazneen, we will be asking each of our invited thought leaders to address one question relating to the theme of resilience and growth in Bangladesh. Against a backdrop of huge disruption caused by the COVID pandemic, we'll be asking, how does Bangladesh sustain its growth momentum and deliver progressive development to benefit all? What potential do trends from collective action and innovative city design and different forms of activism have to reshape and secure the future of Bangladesh? So after we've heard from our speakers, the session will move into a discussion and a Q&A where we'll have an opportunity for interaction with the audience, and hopefully we'll hear from many of those who are participating with us today. So before I hand over to Sohela, I'd just like quickly to introduce our speakers today. And first, certainly, our moderator, Sohela Nazneen, an IDS Research Fellow in our Governance Cluster. Her research focuses on gender and politics, feminist movements, women's empowerment in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. She's the convener of IDS's flagship MA program on gender and development. And before joining IDS, she was a professor at the Department of International Relations, University of Dhaka, and a research fellow based at BRAC Institute of Governance and Development in Bangladesh. Then we have Professor Ronak Yahan, is a distinguished fellow at the Center for Policy Dialogue, CPD, Bangladesh, a professor of political science at Dhaka University, and an adjunct professor of international affairs at Columbia University. She headed the women's program at the US Asia Pacific Development Center, Kuala Lumpur, and the ILO in Geneva. And she's the author of several internationally acclaimed books, including the book that predicted breakup of Pakistan and Bangladesh's independence, and numerous articles. And she has a PhD in political science from Harvard University. Imran Matin is Executive Director of BRAC Institute of Governance and Development, which is a leading research and postgraduate education institute at BRAC University. Prior to his current role, Imran worked with BRAC, Save the Children International, and Innovations for Poverty Action. And he has a PhD in economics from the University of Sussex in the UK, which of course we know well. Firdaus Azim is Professor of Literature in the Department of English and Humanities at BRAC University, executive member of Naripoko, a leading feminist activist group, and her work combines literary interests with her social activism, writing on issues of women, their place in the national imaginary, as well as the place of women in literature. She heads the program entitled The Forgotten Women of 1971, which aims to restore dignity to Barangonas, or the rape survivors of the Liberation War. And she published widely, guest edited issues of Feminist Review and Inter-Asia Cultural Studies. And we have Professor Adnan Morshed, an architect and architectural historian. His academic work focuses on history and theory of modern architecture and urbanism, urban poverty and spatiality, Water and Architectural Historiography in Developing Countries. His PhD and master's come from MIT. His book, Impossible Heights, Skyscrapers, Flight, and the Master Builder, examines the American fascination with the skyscraper and the airplane as part of a widely shared cultural phenomenon, the aesthetics of ascension. He's the founder director of the Center for Inclusive Architecture and Urbanism at Brak University in Dhaka. And finally, Dr. Lalufa Yasmin is professor at the Department of International Relations at the University of Dhaka, Bangladesh. She completed her master's from Georgia State University and a PhD from Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. She's a former Fulbright scholar, and she works on Bangladesh's foreign policy, China's rise and the Indo-Pacific region, female peacekeeping, and women, peace and security agendas, and on countering violent extremism. Now, unfortunately, today we don't have with us Naomi Hossain and Taslima Akhtar, who unfortunately, due to other issues, have had their participation has been affected, so we won't have them today. But we certainly appreciated engaging with them prior to this webinar happening. But I think you'll agree this is an amazing group of speakers. It's a really fascinating and important topic about a country that we certainly recognize has achieved an enormous amount in the last 50 years and certainly is going to achieve much more. And I think that's what the conversation is about today. So I'll hand over to Sohela Nazneen to moderate for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to all my panelists for agreeing to be a part of this. Particularly, it's very early in the US and it's getting quite late in Dhaka, so we really do appreciate having you here. The panel's title is basically looking at Bangladesh at 50, resilience and growth. We are looking back, but we are also looking at how do we move forward. As Peter has said, COVID-19 poses certain challenges, but also for Bangladesh, we have tackled the first generation of development challenges in terms of, if you look at sort of the rise in life expectancy. When Bangladesh gained independence, it used to be around 40 years, and now it's 72. If you look at girls' education and women's literacy rate, what it was in the 70s, and you look at it now, we have gender parity in education. If you think about sort of other development goals that we have attained, not just social development growth, but the spectacular rate of economic growth and fall in absolute poverty, it's been a fantastic journey for Bangladesh. But the question is basically, how do we tackle the second generation in terms of building sustainable structures, building systems, and sort of sustaining the momentum that we have? So our speakers are going to reflect on these issues, usually in terms of the traditional areas that we focus on in terms of politics, in terms of economics, in terms of women's role in development, but also sort of the unusual areas in terms of innovation when we think about urban planning and also looking at Bangladesh's role in global politics. So without further ado, the way it would go is I will pose a particular question to each of the speakers. We have a running order, and after that we will open up. So my first question is to Ronak, and this is about around politics. So Bangladesh has seen quite a few political upheavals, and our transition to democracy happened in the 1991. The question that we are posing is in terms of looking at sustainable governance structures, are they there? And how do you think the way politics is structured right now in Bangladesh, would that sustain an equitable and a just kind of society? Would it lead to that? So Ronak, you have the floor. You have about 6 minutes.
Thank you, Sohela, and thanks to IDS for organizing this webinar. Actually, there are two questions that you have posed me, bundled into one, and I will try to address both in 6 minutes. And if I go over time, you are free to stop me. So let me first address the question of sustainability of government structures. And as you have already mentioned, that Bangladesh had lots of up and downs in terms of our political trajectory. I often say that we had a roller coaster ride. But if you are looking at governance structures, then what you see that we have a formal system of governance, but at the same time, we have an informal arrangement for governance. And all the changes in the last 50 years that you see, that is more in the formal governance structures. So we started with parliamentary system, we went to presidential, we had military takeover, then we had again back to electoral democracy, we had a parliamentary system. So there had been all these changes. But if you look at the informal arrangements of governance, then you find that actually there hasn't been that many changes, that there is a sustained continuity in that. And what is that? Is that from the beginning, really, we had, despite all these changes in the formal structures, informally, there has been a centralization of power in the hands of the chief executive, whether it is the prime minister or the president or the chief martial law administrator. And so this kind of centralized power in the hands of the chief executive, that has actually sustained over 50 years. The second feature of the governance structure is that power is not only centralized in the hands of the chief executive. What we find that it is not, in terms of exercise of power, it is not so much institutionalized power, but it is personal power. So in that way, that we had over the last 50 years, 5 persons who really, their power came from their own person. And that has really been the way power has been exercised. Starting with Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, going to Zia, Ershad, Khaleda Zia, and now our Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. And they do hold some formal power, governance power, but their real power is really in terms of, it is more personalized. Then the question that people may ask, or in political science literature, we find, we would say, well, if it is not institutionalized, then it is not sustainable. I don't know about the future. All I'm trying to point out that for the last 50 years, actually this has been sustained. So that's the point I want to make. The third point I want to make is that we have all these political sort of various political institutions who are the trappings, and they do perform certain roles. But again, if you see who really exercises power, then there has been a continuous, sustainable one institution, and that is the administration and bureaucracy. So power really through the person is being exercised either by the presidential office or the prime minister's office, which is really the main governance structure. And that again also has been sustained over 50 years. And the final point about the governance structure is that over the last 50 years, we really have not developed any democratic accountability structures in governance. Our parliament has not really functioned, political parties, judiciary, they are not really functioning properly. But again, as I said, that this is just not new, this has continued. Going to your second question about whether these are enabling development of equitable and just society, I want to make several points. First, that apart from the first government of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who made a commitment to socialism and towards creating an equitable, just society, and Bangabandhu used to talk about that he wants to reduce income inequality, and he used to talk about fight against exploitation. After his assassination, in fact, no other regime actually talks about equitable, just society as the goal of governance. After the assassination of Bangabandhu, socialism as one of the founding principles were deleted from the constitution, for example. And from then on, since we have been following more or less the same kinds of economic policy, and that is market-friendly economic policy. And so no matter what the change of regimes have been, whether we are under military government or under electoral democracy, the goal really is development, social development or economic growth. But our political or leaders really don't talk about equitable and sustainable or just society. And as we know, I don't want to go into details, that our parliament, our cabinet, all of this are very heavily dominated by the newly moneyed class of people, and they don't really are not interested in equitable or just society. But I want to so that this discourse of rights, with which we started, had from 75 onwards have been really overtaken by the discourse of development. And all the pride and in our celebration, we are also talking about all of our social development and all of our economic growth. Nobody is really talking about whether we are creating a just and equitable society. And in fact, if you look at all the data, you see, yes, we had economic growth, but at the same time, in Bangladesh, in terms of the inequity, that has been one of the fastest rate of growth. I want to end on one thought, and that is that who actually in Bangladesh wants equitable and just society? Because there isn't really that much talk about that, except in very small circles of intellectuals or some leftist political parties, and they cannot get more than even 100 people on the street to fight for this. So I have been really lately thinking that whether the ordinary people, if they are given a choice, are they not will be satisfied that, okay, I have the bridge, I have the road, I have all this metro rail, I have electricity. So whether in terms of the broad masses of people, is there really a very visible demand for equitable and just society? Or this cry for equitable and just society is limited to a handful of people, and they are not going to get, they have not been able to make it a very popular demand as we had been able to make in the 50s and 60s, when there was a mass support for democracy, for socialism, and that was enshrined as our founding principles. If our founding principles can be just removed at the stroke of a pen and nobody is fighting for it, then the conclusion is that not the masses of the people probably are not really demanding it, or the intellectuals or the handful who want it have not been able to mobilize mass support. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ronak, for that very sober reminder that who's talking about equitable, just society while we discuss development and growth and what's the narrative and how the narrative has shifted. So I will move on to Imran, linking with that. So COVID-19 will exacerbate inequity, and inequity in particular ways in the society, whether that's around economic impact or social impact. So while Bangladesh has done quite well in terms of reducing poverty, obviously there are chances that poverty rates will go up, and what happens to economic growth. So Imran, what are your thoughts on how COVID-19 will affect this or exacerbate this? But also, are there new opportunities in the ways of addressing these impacts? So you have about 6 minutes, Imran.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to this event. I think to understand the impact of COVID, I think COVID has just sort of aggravated or exacerbated what the sort of the structural challenges we anyway had. So I don't think the COVID effect can be divorced from the underlying structure of growth and progress that we have made and the vulnerabilities within that. So let me talk about that, and then I'll get to sort of COVID. So I think Ranagapa started, with this whole the whole notion of sort of inequality and how that has been really increasing over the last 10, 12 years. And I think, of course, she raised a very pertinent sort of political question, which I hope we can get into the conversation. But if you unpack this, the structure of inequality, then I think it'll help us understand how COVID effect has actually worked, right? So there are, I think, the central notion of this, the way inequality works is through exacerbating vulnerability and precarity. And I think, we need to really centralize the notion of vulnerability and precarity if we want to really, make maybe even inequality a political agenda. I think vulnerability and precarity of people's livelihoods, any progress people are making, is a far more politically palpable, kind of a notion than inequality, which is really abstract or even just. But this vulnerability, sort of manifests itself in the context of Bangladesh, given the structure of inequality, I think in 3 domains. One is urban. It's been really clear that urban inequality has been much worse than rural, right? So this is, and again, we know that urban precarity of livelihood is far more, right? The second dimension of this vulnerability is gender. And the third dimension is youth. And all these 3 have actually played in the COVID context, right? This is where the new poor comes from. It is the vulnerable non-poor. It is that those precarious livelihoods which are above the poverty line, but not that above. And that have actually, without any social protection mechanisms, have just kind of fallen through, right? So I think this is one really important thing to really kind of, I think sort of understand. So it is the structure of inequality. And I think COVID has just played into that, right? The second is, I think, the financial sector fragility. And this, again, has been going on for quite a few years. It links up with overall governance of institutions, that, and the independence of certain types of institutions, of central bank, of the bank governance structures, which is really plays into that. And the financial sector, primarily governance fragility, and overall its weak foundation, meant that during COVID, when we tried to use that platform to actually provide any financial, support, it just did not work. It is not, it just did not work. The uptake of all of this support is extremely low. The whole small, medium enterprise support stimulus package uptake is less than 5%. And it's primarily because of the fragility of the financial sector. So I think that's the sort of second really important thing, and it plays into the COVID impact. And the third is the general, kind of weak implementation muscle of our local bureaucracy. We know this, our implementation of annual development plans and budget is very low. And that is where, again, that inefficiency has played into not having any mechanism in place, any innovative mechanism in place to actually provide any kind of support during COVID. And so what has that led to is people having to manage with their informal mechanisms. It is not, I think, lack of sort of policy thinking. It is the fragility of all of these platforms through which we would not be able to, we fail to really kind of sort of have any kind of centralized support basically going. If I have 2 more minutes, I can just talk a bit about the sort of COVID in particular, how these 3 elements, the vulnerability and precarity of our GDP growth and poverty reduction, how our financial sector fragility and our fragility of our implementation muscle, how they have fed into the 2 big crises that is now, I think, staring at our face. So one big crisis is this crisis of this new poor. And this new poor are people who, population who are above the poverty line. These are vulnerable non-poor who are below the median income, but above the upper poverty line, who have just fallen into poverty. And we find that about 15% of the vulnerable non-poor who are non-poor before COVID have fallen into poverty. And this is long-term poverty. We have been tracking along with PPRC for 1 year. About 15% of vulnerable non-poor are stuck. Some have escaped, but 15% are just stuck into poverty, right? So this obviously would have an impact in terms of overall poverty headcount ratio and so on and so forth. And this is 25 million people. Now, and again, the face of this is urban and women. And I think this is really important. Urban and women, and women's labor force participation, which was anyway stalling even before COVID, have just stalled right now. I mean, the stickiness of unemployment of women. Once woman withdraws from the labor market, it is so much more difficult because of the economic and non-economic constraints and barriers for them to re-engage in the labor market. And we keep on seeing this across several surveys. So I think this is one big phase. The second is, and I did not talk about the other fragility, which is really important in our overall structure, which is our education fragility. We have been, kind of really creating education inflation across all levels and let standards just go down the bottomless pit, which has basically led to the kind of crisis we see right now. And that is with the 1 year closure of schools and auto pass and all of this stuff. The human capital recovery or human capital crisis has just become so much more, I think, critical for us. And it's going to have so much more of a lasting impact in terms of ossifying some of these inequalities that we anyway saw before. So I think, I am obviously not being a pessimist, but I just look at all of this, and I think there are opportunities here. But we just need to get our acts together, and we can. We have demonstrated that if we do get our acts together in a multi-actor oriented approach, we can resolve these type of things. There are social innovations that we know how to basically kind of design and scale up. But I think that would require a non-business as usual approach if you really want to tackle. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Imran, and thanks for sticking to time even after asking for 2 minutes. So you finished within those 2 minutes. Thank you for drawing attention to structures of inequality and then how COVID exacerbates that and the risks of new poor, but also sort of going beyond business as usual. I'm sure the audience will pick that up. Just a reminder to the audience that if you want to put your questions in the chat box, keep doing that. We will be collating those and asking the speakers to respond to those in the Q&A session. But I'm going to move to Firdaus now. So Imran mentioned obviously gender being one of the key categories and women being affected by COVID, but also the different kind of vulnerabilities that women face. But we also have a history of women's activism and a history of gains in terms of gains around gender equality. So I wanted to ask you, Firdaus, basically, what are, of course, we know what the challenges are, but in terms of women's collective action and women's mobilization and demands for rights from the state, but also from the community, what are the possibilities there, or are there new opportunities opening up despite these barriers? So you're welcome to reflect on the barriers and how the situation is grave, but also where do you think we are going with that? Because women are a big part of Bangladesh's development story and success.
Okay, thank you, Sohela. I don't know whether I will be sticking to your questions, but I will have my own kind of spin on the women's movement and our response at this juncture of time. I just wanted to tell everyone that I'm also a Sussex alumnus. I did my PhD at the Department of English long ago and far away. But yeah, so it's good to be in a Sussex kind of cohort here. Yeah, so while you were talking, while I was kind of thinking about this 5-minute pitch that I would have, I was thinking of the issues and questions that have remained constant from in the last 50 years, and how women have been written in or written out of the story. The development story has focused on women. We know that there was this whole targeting women, and that was sometimes guided by those international women's conferences, etc., by resources coming into women and development or gender and development as the debate went on. Sometimes it was guided from another front, the women's movement front, which were talking about women's position in society. So looking at these two things together, I would like to turn our attention away from the so-called golden girls that we have all become, because we are the flags, banners that proclaim where Bangladesh has gone in the 50 years, to looking at those issues that have remained with us and how they form the debate even today. And if I have the time, wonder how we go forward with them. The first thing, and this is something that is concerning, that is of big concern to me at the moment, and that's my concern, is the way women have been part of the Bangladesh narrative, the narrative of the birth of Bangladesh. And I think Bangladesh has not really, or the Bangladesh historians, the history narratives have not really come to terms with the figure of the raped women of 71, the Biranganas. And I say this because we are celebrating 50 years of Bangladesh. We're celebrating a victory of independence. And we have a very easy narrative of those bad guys and us, the good guys. But when we look at this history, we will see a self-critique happening. Because talking to women, you will realize that these 50 years for Biranganas has been a tale of rejection, of being shamed, of being completely ostracized from society. So I just feel that it is at the heart of our history, of our birth, that there is an undecided or an apparition that has not gone away. And that is something that the women's movement, that thinkers, that historians have to deal with at the moment. The second thing I keep on feeling is taking on from what Rona Kappa was saying about inequalities and inequities and how we don't talk about them anymore. Even when we talk about the development of women, women's development, Imran was talking about the precarity of women's position, that the first line to get affected by the COVID, the first people to drop into poverty, and the most difficult to come out of poverty will be women workers, are women workers and will be women workers. So even while we celebrate the formation of women workers, of a group of workers who are contributing to our economy, blah, 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 all of that we keep on saying, golden girls of Bangladesh, we have not addressed a very basic constitutional question which derives on our rights. And that is the inequality, the gender inequality that is enshrined in our constitution. The equality that the constitution talks about, even the glorious 72 constitution, is between men and women, is in the public, but not in the private. And in this dichotomy that is created between the public and the private, we have kept that old colonial way of making laws that create divisions between different members of society. And here, not only is there a gender difference, but a communal difference has been enshrined in our personal laws that guide the very basic principles of family, et cetera, in our lives. So that is something that the women's movement has been dealing with since 72, and is still a question that concerns and and animates our campaigns, etc. And the third issue I would bring about is the whole issue of violence against women, which we now have reframed into gender-based violence. And that gender-based violence is the thing that comes out of a politics around women's bodies and women's sexuality, which has not gone away, which has not just not gone away, but hasn't even been addressed in any sustained manner. So I think if we talk about women's organizing, women's campaigns, it is going to, violence is going to remain a very big aspect and issue of it. Yesterday, I was in a seminar where we were talking about the rights of sex workers, and sex workers were identifying themselves, and I'm talking about gains of the women's movement in the last 50 years now, as people who have been empowered to approach the local government, to approach the DC, to walk into the DC's office and demand their rights, which was unthinkable perhaps before the 90s. But despite that, there are attacks on women. There is the whole issue of keeping women defined and confined within their position as determined by their sexuality. So unless we talk about a holistic approach to women's liberation, not just the equality of women and their rights but women's freedom, the basic issues, the specter that haunts all of us, which we see everywhere, from our homes to the state to internationally, as our women go out to work. I think these are the issues that will concern us. The second thing that the women's movement has been grappling with, and as you know very well, Sohela, is this whole thing is that, are we just limited to a certain class of women? And are we just limited to a certain generation of women? And this is something that we have been grappling with and strategizing to increase our constituency, to spread our constituency. And I think we have used different strategies at different points. But during this COVID times, what we as veteran feminists have discovered are a new generation of young feminists. And that is precisely these limitations of meeting. So we've come across a whole lot of Facebook warriors, as we call them, or whatever kind of social media warriors, etc. But we have joined together, and a fresh conversation, and I think a very healthy conversation and debate started, where new methods, new strategies of organizing, etc., are being looked at, are being worked for, and a new generation of women, including school-going women, because schools are shut now, are being able to get together, meet, and talk about issues. And I think so we are resilient enough to, in these times, to reformulate ourselves into new ways of organizing. And yeah, that's what I'd like to say at this point.
Thank you, Firdaus, for drawing attention to the intersectional impact of inequality. I mean, it's not just gender, the impact is different for different groups of women, but also the agenda of decolonization. I mean, I know we talk about it in the academia here, and we are talking about it in terms of the context of race, but for post-colonial states, obviously, in terms of the colonial structures and its impact and what does it mean, the debate is different, but it is there in terms of how do we deal with the legacy. But apart from that, also drawing attention to sort of intersectional organizing and organizing across generations, and what does it mean for the debate, not just debate around women's rights, but also sort of how do we move forward on the issues where we have been stuck, like, for example, violence against women. So let's move forward to Adnan. And Adnan's question, obviously, Imran drew your attention to urban poverty and sort of the growth of new poor, but urbanization has been happening rapidly, and development of inclusive systems and inclusive cities are a challenge, and how we sort of design cities, but also urban planning and sort of role of architecture in that is a key issue. So Adnan, basically my question to you is, and it's a very easy one, in the last 50 years, what have been the innovations in sort of design, but also what role does urban planning and architecture has to play in terms of creation of cities that are more equitable and inclusive?
Okay, thank you, Sohela, and thank you, IDS, for this conference. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak to these issues. I think, I don't know, 50 innovation in the past 50 years in 5 minutes, that would be a daunting challenge. But let me address that. Let me begin with a somber reminder that I would like to refer to Raunak Appa's question that who is talking about social injustice, social inequity today? Who is demanding the mitigation of social injustices and mitigation strategies? Let me give two quick examples, and then I will sort of expand, if I may, in 5 minutes. Recently, two occurrences in Bangladesh drew my attention, and I was troubled, to be frank. One was a very powerful company, economic agglomerate, wanted to create a 5-star hotel in the Chittagong hill tracts, in the midst of the tribal lands that many tribes, indigenous tribes consider sacred. This is their spiritual home. And in the midst of that spiritual home, the land they held sacred for centuries, all of a sudden you wanted to create a 5-star hotel for the super rich, and at what environmental cost? So it raises the question of environmental injustice to the fore. It brings the question of environmental injustice to the forefront. So I want to use that notion of this 5-star hotel and entertainment center in the midst of indigenous land. What does it tell us about our contemporary scenarios of our environmental spatial practices? Number one. Number two is, very recently, a governmental ministry wanted to redevelop a park in the middle of the city in Dhaka. Think about, Hyde Park in London. You want to go and create 20 restaurants inside Hyde Park all of a sudden, because you wanted to give this business to your friends and so on. So the ministry, two ministries, wanted to develop a scheme inside that historic park where which has many memories of our liberation war. Many events took place inside that park. So the new development scheme for that park entailed the cutting of 150 historic trees and creation of facilities like restaurants, 7 restaurants inside that historic park at great environmental cost. What does that tell us about our contemporary environmental practices? So I think to address the question of how does our spatial practices exacerbate social injustices, I would say that we are still do not have the right tools, right planning tools to mitigate these kinds of injustices spatial injustices that are still happening. To answer these questions, let me go, as a historian, I would like to take a long view of our evolution, architectural or spatial evolution, to address these questions of spatial injustices. In fact, I would say that in 1971, at the birth of Bangladesh, architecturally or urbanistically, Bangladesh began with two key catalysts. One catalyst was the kind of the great globalization of architectural practice during the 1960s, during the pivotal decade of Bangladesh's political agitation towards self-rule. And that quote and unquote golden age in the 1960s brought a lot of international stars to create experimental or iconic architecture in Bangladesh. That created a cosmopolitan, very enlightened view of architecture in Bangladesh. So, which of course includes our great iconic Parliament building, which you may know. It's an icon of world architecture, designed by an American architect. And there were many other international architects from abroad coming to Bangladesh, this little tiny country in South Asia, and creating a very a rich sort of architectural culture in the 60s. And then, of course, another catalyst was 1971 Liberation War, which created a kind of a liberatory spirit that catalyzed the next generation of architectural urban practices. And of course, in the 1970s, variety of, there were challenges. In fact, extreme limitation of resources was paradoxically a catalyst for new thinking, new innovations, and so on, which kind of magnified in the 1980s, alongside all kinds of social innovations in the 1980s. Architecture too also embarked on a journey to find or create some kind of national identity through spatial means. So there was search, and there were all kinds of, I would like to call the decade of the 1980s the brick decade. And the brick, of course, is a metaphor for some kind of indigenous identity, some kind of innovations with local materials and local technology, indigenous technologies. And there were architects who searched for new innovative ways of space making. So 80s was an important decade for the growth of architectural thinking, urbanistic thinking in Bangladesh. But at the same time, in the 1980s, a few important things happened. One was, of course, the RMG sector, ready-made garment sector, which brought a lot of people to the city, which kind of led to urbanization and then remittance. A lot of money came into Bangladesh. So it led to a sustained process of urbanization, which then in the 1990s became a major sort of catalyst for architectural growth. In the 1990s, a key actor in this process of urbanization was the real estate developers. And as you would know, as you look at other examples, other developing countries, when urbanization becomes a dominant force of growth, there would, of course, be tremendous pressure on land. And as you know, Bangladesh is a small country with a large population load. So there was a huge demand on land in the 1990s, and real estate developers played a very important role in that, but without necessarily a sense of environmental justice, predominantly serving the upper middle class. Another very important factor that we should consider in the 1990s is the rise of the middle class. But there were two types of middle class but excuse my brevity here. There were two types of middle classes here. One was the economic middle class, the new economic middle class. The other was kind of old cultural middle class. The new middle class became a new economic middle class, became a patron of architecture. And of course, they patronized a kind of architecture that did not necessarily consider environmental justice or social justice. So, for example, to give you an example, there are 4 million RMG workers in Dhaka alone. Even after 4 decades of RMG's contribution to our GDP, our national economy, we have not been able to provide housing for these female workers in our RMG sector. So it tells you a story that despite these glossy infrastructure and upper middle class oriented architectural practices and urbanization, we have not been able to raise the voice about environmental justice, the kind of justice, Ronak Appa, Firdaus Appa, and Imran have been talking about. So I think overall, in this narrative of growth, urbanization, and architectural development, we have not been able to voice our, sort of raise this question: how do we ensure social justice? And social justice is environmental justice in many ways, although in our policy questions, policy debates, we oftentimes do not talk about the spatial dimension of development. I think it has to come with a robust environmental literacy campaign. So, as I said, Bangladesh is a small country with a huge population load. We cannot be oblivious of the spatial dimension of our growth. So, in other words, so to go back to these questions of a 5-star hotel in a tribal land or development in a park benefiting certain rich quarters, access in a way is a glaring example of our lack of imagination or lack of sensitivity toward environmental justice that should be a sort of a very pivotal policy question in our thought about the future in a post-pandemic world. So I don't know, do I have any time, or that's it, more or less?
I'm going to stop you there, Adnan.
Okay, all right, okay.
But thank you for drawing attention to the issue of spatiality and how important it is to development, but also the dimension around the class dimension that exists in urban planning and urban development and what it means, because housing is a key issue, but so is also how we think about the space and environmental justice. For the audience, keep the questions coming in the chat box. James is monitoring it. And I will move on to Lailufer, last but not the least, to talk about Bangladesh's role in global arena. So we talk about Bangladesh in terms of a tiny state, a small state. Sometimes we say we have a huge population and there's a particular narrative. But Bangladesh has also contributed hugely to peacekeeping and also in the way we deal with natural disaster. So in a way, I'm asking, are we still a small state, or has that changed for us? Are we there yet in terms of the global scene? Lailufer, you have 6 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Sohela, for inviting me, and especially I want to thank IDS for showcasing Bangladesh, involving Bangladeshis over there. Yes, Sohela, it's a very interesting question, because that's how I was going to open that. In foreign policy term, in terms of spatiality, in terms of geographic size, yes, it's a small country, but in terms of foreign policy goals and objectives and how Bangladesh has been able to project itself in international arena. we can no longer call it a small country, because if we look at the small power index, it's a 30 million or less. The countries with 30 million or less population are called small power. But there are other also characteristics involved with it. For example, if a country has enough bargaining power, if a country can make it presence felt in the international arena. So when we take a holistic view towards Bangladesh's foreign policy exercise with 165 million people, a market of 165 million people, one might argue that the market mostly Dhaka-centric or urban area-centric, but Bangladesh cannot be called as a small state, and I'm afraid we have this particular mindset imbued in such a manner that often internationally we fail to project ourselves. Often we fail to assert ourselves as Bangladesh, as a Bangladeshi, and how Bangladesh has made a number of differences. For example, Bangladesh started off in 1971 with zero foreign currency reserve. The latest figure says is $45.1 billion that we have in foreign reserve. Not only that, if you followed yesterday's news, for the first time Bangladesh has emerged as a lender, as a lending country. We are lending money to Sri Lanka. So there are a number of issues that we can be proud of. And another thing that we have to understand, that Bangladesh's foreign policy is based on friendship with all, allies to none, which means that Bangladesh is one of the very few countries where growth has happened without any enmity, without any altercation with any other countries. Then there are, other issues. Bangladesh's contribution, as you have mentioned, in UN peacekeeping forces. Bangladesh's very unique contribution in promoting women, peace and security agenda, which was solely Bangladesh's contribution, and looking at how women can be a part of peacemaking, peace building process. Some of the other areas that, from foreign policy perspective, I'd like to point out that often we have seen in the writings of, IR scholars in 70s, 80s, even in 90s, that Bangladesh has been identified as a victim of geography. Why? Because Bangladesh is surrounded by India on three sides. We share fifth largest land border with a small strip of opening with Myanmar. So we thought that it's a victim of geography. But from 2013 and 14, when we have been able to resolve our maritime dispute with both Myanmar and India, Bangladesh has emerged as a country which is now, in international media it is called as move away, made in China. It's time for made in Bangladesh. So we have strength in RMG sector, we have strength in manpower sector, but some other areas that we forget, that Bangladesh is second largest supplier of online labor right after India. These are the facts that often we forget to promote. Then again, we also need to look at that how Bay of Bengal has opened up a new vista of opportunities for Bangladesh, because now look at during 2020 and 2021 in a survey carried out by Japanese Ministry of Commerce, Japanese want to when they want to shift their investment from China, what is their first destination, what is their first choice? That is Bangladesh. So we have created some kind of appeal to the countries with money who want to come here, invest here, and there are special economic zones created for Japan, a special economic zone for China, and there are this way Bangladesh has opened up. So Bangladesh's success, it can be identified as a part of development diplomacy. Let me sort of assert here that Bangladesh has not followed a typical pattern of economic diplomacy. Rather, from 2013-14 onward, if you see how great powers are flocking here, that Bangladesh can be used as an Indo-Pacific corridor, linking the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. Then also how Japan is calling Bangladesh as a linchpin situated at the mouth of the Bay of Bengal. Then Russians are saying we are seriously coming back and for a long time. How great power involvement in Bangladesh has increased because we have been able to provide certain kind of economic sort of development goals for them, development opportunities for them. So here we can see that also that our locational disadvantage that has turned out to be our biggest locational advantage in 50 years time. And but I would also like to point out that there are several features there, like the Rohingya issue. A lot of when we are talking about if Bangladesh is a small country or not, some of the scholars have argued it is a small country indeed because it has not been able to resolve the Rohingya crisis. So we need to remember one thing there, that there's something called collective power. Rohingya crisis happened because Myanmar took advantage of a crack in the international system, international order, where there is no responsible power to maintain systemic, balance. And that is when first, you can see Crimea, Russian invasion in Ukraine, that created the Crimea situation. 2017, it is the Rohingya influx in Bangladesh. So it is an international problem. It is not only Bangladesh's problem, where we need a concerted effort coming from a number of international partners to resolve this crisis. So Rohingya crisis is not only Bangladesh's responsibility. This is one disadvantage that Bangladesh, in terms of foreign policy, Bangladesh is experiencing now. Second is that Bangladesh lacks a comparative advantage over other South Asian countries in terms of the kind of products that we can offer globally. Those are also offered by other South Asian neighbors. So here there's a steep competition among South Asian countries. That is another one. And then our export market is oriented towards the West. So IR, recently we have been talking from, during the pandemic period, IR is heavily, colonized subject, discipline. So here we can see that how we can promote, non-Western voices. So here I find that Bangladesh can take up this mantle of promoting a Bangladeshi, distinctly Bangladeshi voice, a distinctly post-colonial voice, a distinctly a voice where how state from non-Western non-Western field, it can create a place for itself. And I'll finish with just one point. I know that PPRC and BIGT did a work on what are the condition of women during the COVID-19 period. So US withdrawal from Afghanistan, that is going to create a new kind of Talibanization of Afghanistan. So Bangladesh has a lot to fear from that situation, because women are the first victim of job cut, which Dr. Motain here in their presentation phrased as feminization of joblessness. So here it's not only women are the first victims of job cut, but these women are competent women, tech-savvy women. So how Taliban and IS and other violent extremist groups, they are going to recruit and target these women who want money, who want their agency to be heard. So this is another area, because in Southeast Asia's context, we have seen that a lot of female extremists were recruited via online chat boxes. And now that even the terrorists have their own research cell, they are studying how to expand their activities, just the way we try to understand what are the reasons for recruitment and terrorist activities. So there's a huge fear that they might expand their operation in South Asia, in Central Asia, because they need more foot soldiers. They need more terrorists to take up their work. So given all of these issues, I just reiterate a few points and then finish that Bangladesh is not a small country in terms of foreign policy practice. Bangladesh has unique contribution in international politics, because we have taken up the mantle of UN mandate on maintaining international peace and security by contributing to even peacekeeping forces, both male forces and female forces. Bangladesh has uniquely introduced development diplomacy, which is distinct from economic diplomacy. Bangladesh has taken up port diplomacy in light of its unfettered access to Bay of Bengal. So a lot of issues, and Bangladesh's growth has happened without enmity with any other countries of the world. That is something unique. Thank you, Sohela, for inviting me here and giving me a chance to flag my country. Thank you.
Thank you, Lailufer, and thank you for taking us beyond the usual development discussions that we have and pointing towards that it happens within a particular geopolitical aspect, and also that foreign policy and security agendas are linked to development, that we all know, but we focus mainly on development. Having said that, to the audience, keep the questions coming in the chat box, but I will start, and using the moderator's prerogative, I will choose the questions that I sort of feel like needs to go first, and I'll pose it to the panelists. And panelists, you have 2 minutes to respond to these. not an easy feat. So Firdaus, the first question is for you from Hillary Standing, and basically asking you to sort of elaborate a bit more on the perception of how the new generation of feminists you identified view the future of feminism and feminist organizing. So Firdaus, you have 2 minutes to answer that. Very easy question. You're muted, Firdaus.
There is a standing debate about how this new generation of feminists, as we'd like to call them, we're calling it an intergenerational movement. But the new generation, according to the old generation, is too concentrated on media platforms. And there is a need, of course, you reach more people, but as we were talking about constitution building, constituency building, that you need to reach a wider variety of women. You need to have many kinds of women speaking or having their voices heard within the movement. And we know that this medium that has made it possible to organize easier, better, all of that, there is no substitute for actually going out and meeting people, talking to them, and being together, and for those wonderful marches that have to be organized all the time. So that is one thing that we feel that how do these Facebook warriors become real warriors on the street? And their question is that, do you need to be street warriors? Why can't we just be this? So there is a strategic point at which we meet and at which we differ, but there is a huge concern about violence against women, about the spate of rape that we have seen even in COVID times. There's a huge concern about women dropping out of school, about women losing jobs, about women's lives becoming more precarious. And how are we going to deal with it is the question that is animating our talk and is matter of huge concern for all of us. Yeah.
Thank you, Firdaus. So from there, I'll move on to Adnan, and Mariangela has posed 2 questions, but I'm picking this one. So Adnan, you have 2 minutes to reflect on whether you see a role for innovations such as collective land titles or community land trusts or other forms of community managed land in urban areas as a way to ensure that social value can be maintained around social justice, but also to help address some of the issues that real estate development and rapid privatization of how things are happening pose.
That's a great question, and it's a question at the heart of Bangladesh's future. I think it's a wonderful question. So thank you for asking that. If you go to the outskirts of Dhaka, Ashulia, which is a kind of a proto-industrial sort of zone in Dhaka, where a lot of ready-made garments factories are. If you go there, you will see that there are a lot of signboards that this is the property of this company or that company, and so this is a very typical scenario, not only in Dhaka but across the country. If you go to Borishal, or if you go to the villages in Chittagong or Kushtia or Sylhet, you will see that there are signboards in the middle of this pristine green landscape, a paddy field, that says this is the property of this company. So I think the future of Bangladesh is there is a kind of a very precarious scenario of privatization of land. And I think, so that's why, I was saying that, Lailufer, when I said that Bangladesh is a small country, by no means I wanted to undermine Bangladesh's enormous progress, enormous value, and I didn't mean to undermine the success story of Bangladesh. No, I take pride in Bangladesh's success story. You know, Bangladesh has made enormous progress in a variety of social fields and so on. But I think when I say small country, I look at the challenge of utilizing every square inch of the country for community benefit, for social justice, for environmental justice. In fact, architect Mazharul Islam, the first professional architect in Bangladesh, back in the 70s, asked Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman that we should have a complete comprehensive plan for the entire country so that there is social justice, there is the kind of, so that we won't have the kind of rampant privatization of land that we are seeing today. I mean, think about some of the very sort of natural drainages of Dhaka has disappeared because of the privatization of the land. Just to give you a few numbers, there are 65 canals, historic canals have been identified in Dhaka alone. Only 26 exists. Why is that? Because of that not having comprehensive planning of the city or the land use planning. So I think we should kind of, to address the question, we have to have policies in place to stop this rampant privatization of land, because we can't have any control over those lands. So community ownership of land and some innovation is the, one way of ensuring environmental justice in the future, so that tribal communities, indigenous communities in the hill tracts would not lose their lands. So I think, for example, in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, land ownership is in a kind of a no man's land. Nobody has a clear answer. Who is the owner? Is it the government? Is it the tribal communities? Who is the owner? So I think having a robust policy conversation on land ownership as a way to ensure social justice, environmental justice, for Bangladesh in the future is an essential conversation that we need to have.
Thanks, Adnan. So moving on from that, from robust policy conversation, actually, I have a question for both Ronak and Imran, and I'm combining several questions here because a lot of the questions came on Bangladesh's politics and development. So Ronak and Imran, to reflect on, this is from Risat, but also Dr. Moin Khan and others have asked this, is one is, of course, Ronak, you talk about centralized power and personal charisma, and that sort of hindered democratic accountability of the formal institutions. So they want a little bit of elaboration on that, but the focus of the question is the lack of formal institutional structures that makes us rely on informality and informal institutions. So is there any kind of innovative informality that exists or that makes it work better in Bangladesh? So that's question for you, Ronak. Imran, the same question has been posed to you also in terms of the role of informality, and sort of also the question around, can we rely on sort of local structures of governance instead of thinking about, oh, we fix the larger systems? So very easy questions. Ronak, you go first. You have 2 minutes, then Imran.
Okay, thank you, Sohela. This whole question of personalized rule and lack of institution building, it's like a vicious circle, in the sense that when we became independent in 1972, all of our institutions were actually very weak. And also they were all very fractionalized at that time, because there were divisions between who is for liberation and who is not. And so at that time, to even bring some stability or take any decision, then it had to be, we were in a rush. And so that it became very a personalized rule, because nothing got moved unless Bangabandhu really weighed in. Nobody was, people were not, all these various little groups, they were not listening to anybody else. And then, of course, during military rule, it will become very personalized. But when again we came into democratic rule, we have every institution, I mean, the couple of factors are working here, and I don't have time to get into details, but every institution is factionalized. And sometimes for politics, even people who are political leaders, it works to their advantage if there is, say, a lot of faction. So again, we were in a situation when nobody listens to anybody else, and so you need everybody is looking towards one person. Here also, I think we have not done any study, but my hypothesis is that this so-called economic success story, rapid growth, and everybody wants rapid growth, that has been very unregulated. And there has been a rush to just go ahead, elbow your competitor out, and so that if you want to create a system, then of course you have to wait a little, and there has to be you have to follow certain rules. But I think the way we have grown economically very quickly, the other side of the story is that it is unregulated growth, crony capitalism, and nobody wants to create a system, and it is much easier through personalized access to move ahead. And I think these we are applauding our economic growth, and fine, but one has to look at how we reached there, and we let people to compete in any way they can, and then only some people who can push ahead, they are. And just to go back to one thing that Adnan was saying, privatization of land. It is not so much privatization. It is grabbing of land, grabbing of river, grabbing of water sources, and people are minting money by grabbing so many of public things, and the opportunity to make so much money that I never thought existed, that you can sell off somebody else's land, somebody else's water or common water. But it is a very complex story, and I think I would go over my time, but I think these stories, both are related in terms of how we are growing and what are some of the consequences. And if we created a system then and some rules, then probably we would not be able to grow in this kind of a way. Thank you.
So Imran, I will put you on the spot because your institution brings out state of governance reports. Ronak just talked about creating rules and systems. We do have formal rules and systems, but we also rely on informality quite a lot, which you also mentioned. So one of the questions was basically, are there citizen-led local systems that would ensure that at least at the local level, something's happening around being able to demand accountability? I mean, even if the national systems or the formal kind of systems that we see Parliament asking for accountability from bureaucracy may not exist. So what does your latest report say? Would you like to reflect on where are the possibilities for engaging with the state and also getting some answers?
So let me perhaps just take a step back a bit here. I mean, I think, the challenge of governance and accountability is a design problem. And in different contexts and historical junctures, you need to design governance mechanism, institutions, and accountability structures to be able to deliver the outcomes that you're interested in, society is interested in, right? So I think, and this is not only about, I think, you know, one of the ways I think is a kind of this kind of colonial psyche a bit, post-colonial societies, that the idea of governance, you hold the government only to account. Of course, that is a very important part of it, but ultimately it also requires compliance. It also requires certain types of citizen behavior to be able to actually get the kind of outcomes that you're really interested in. So I think that kind of and I think that's where the good governance thinking is a bit problematic, because it sort of, you know, talks about the outcomes and then almost have a Washington consensus type of a theoretical approach in terms of how you get there. And I don't think that's how you know, different societies actually work. And I think Bangladesh you know, kind of will have to chart its own way. I think there are I think promising I think openings, and there are obviously challenges, and there have been U-turns, backlashes, and I think we just need to take all of that and then really, you know, figure out, you know, as academics and intellectuals figure out, you know, what does that really tell us? How do we tell that story for us to really look sort of forward? Now, I think, I mean, right now, you know, I mean, you know, in terms of how informality, the question about informality, how we factor that in, I think the great example is microfinance. If you really think about microfinance grew out of informal social capital and social collateral. The social innovation was how to really use the social capital and into collateral, you know, people's own knowledge about themselves into collateral, and then scale it up and create systems of governance. And ultimately we have microfinance regulatory authority, you know, at the sort of central level to really regulate it. And there's all kind of negotiation that basically goes on between the providers and the regulatory authority. But I think as governance, you know, researchers, it's really important to study some of those. I think microfinance is a fascinating example of how, you know, informality is then turned into social innovation, scaled up, and then how do you create regulatory structures? I think another good example is our telco. You know, I think that is another very good and very interesting example of how, you know, you sort of start off not necessarily by kind of, you know, having all the structures in place, but you allow a bit of space, you know, for innovation, but then you sort of iterate the kind of regulatory structures and the you know, kind of upper end, you know, kind of governance and regulation mechanism or institution that may be needed. Now, there are limits to these. It may not operate in each and every problem, but I think there are many problems, there are class of problems where we can actually use some of this. And for others, we may have to think differently, right? So I think that's the way I would basically think about it. And in the case of COVID, I think what really worked is I think there's been a lot of local level entrepreneurialism that the state itself provided. Because I think one of the things that I think our state of governance that will come out in end of June, hopefully we'll launch it. It sort of tells this story that there's actually been a devolution of authority, at least for that time period, to really be innovative about how to approach this problem. And there have been really interesting partnership between the local government, between the local administration, the police, and local, you know, sort of local structures. So I think there's a lot to learn from how those type of local innovations have actually happened. There are limits to that, you know, when we try and kind of scale it up. But I think there's a lot of learning we need to do. So I really think we need a different kind of a governance research agenda that will be much more helpful in terms of charting our way forward in terms of addressing some of these challenges.
Thank you, Imran, for drawing attention to new kind of research agenda, but also thinking about where is innovation happening. And while there are structural problems, there are also, people also have agency. I mean, not just people, but also state agents have agency. And it's not always a story of despair everywhere. So it's about that. Basically, there is a new question about the NGO sector, but I'm going to park this for now, and I'm going to ask Lailufer, and you have the last word in 1 minute, Lailufer. How do we maintain, because I know you have work on minorities, how do we ensure that the development is inclusive of minority groups in Bangladesh? 1 minute, Lailufer.
Thank you, Sohela, for asking me perhaps the toughest question, because I do work in the areas of IR. And in fact, what I have seen that in the very inclusion of, the identity of Bangladeshi, identity of Bengaliness, we have this uniqueness in Bengal in general, that we have been tolerant to different views, different ideas, and that is how, Islam has been indigenized in this country, and it has a long history of adopting local culture, local practices. So indigenous population, we do have a recognition of them, and the signing of the CHT Peace Treaty back in 1997, I do not think that has resolved all the troubles. So we need to rethink about how to bring them in the center stage of negotiation and talk, and to learn from them, instead of taking a very urban-centric perspective to resolve their issues. Because I've seen in my other works, when we are talking about Rohingya issues or talking about VE-related issues, that there is a tendency to impose urban-centric ideas on different corners, different parts of Bangladesh. But Bangladesh is very different from Dhaka, and Dhaka is very different from other parts of Bangladesh. So when you go to Rajshahi, the urban Bangladesh Dhakaite version looks very alien to them. It is as foreign to them as any other language or any other culture. So I believe when we're talking about minorities' rights, we need to bring them in the forum, we need to learn from them, and then we need to sort of synthesize what is their perception, their ideas, and their sort of rights. CHT, is still, that the 1800 manual, how this is used to, how it is applied in relation to CHT region. But at the same time, we need to understand that how we can bring a national consensus in understanding different perspectives, at the national level. Thank you.
Thanks, Lailufer, for doing that in record time and giving us an overview of what's going on and drawing attention to how Dhaka looks different from rest of the country and why we need to keep that in mind. So I will bring the discussion to a close. With that, we have 3 minutes left, and we did promise IDS Comms that we will finish right on time, because we have another exciting panel on being organized by the Ghana Hub. So my heartfelt thanks to all the panelists for giving us a tour de force kind of overview of what's happening in the field of politics, economics, urban planning, women's movement, and also Bangladesh in global scenario. That's not an easy feat, and also for fielding very difficult questions that required being done in 2 minutes. Thank you to Peter Taylor for giving us a magnificent introduction, and IDS Comms for hosting this, but mostly to the participants of this event who posted fantastic questions and were patient and were with us. So thank you all so much, and we hope to see you all soon for the next event, and hope you all stay safe in this very trying times. And we will post the lecture on YouTube. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you as well. Thank you too, and thank you, IDS.
Thank you. Thank you, IDS. Thank you, Sohela, and we are looking forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Sohela and IDS. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.